Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
Well, thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to
So we'll start in 2-3 minutes now. Amit sir?
Yeah, thanks, man.
Okay. There are some technical issues.
I can see Ambassador Sood has
Yes,
joined.
Ambassador Sood has joined.
Constantino has I don't know about Avinash, sir.
Avinash.
Hello?
He has joined.
Okay.
Let's have a quick audio test. Ambassador Sood, could you please unmute yourself and have a quick video and audio test?
I just want to have a few words with each panelist.
Okay.
Can I first?
Hello. Yes.
So let me check
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hello,
yes, sir, we can hear you. Morning, sir.
Okay. All right. Morning.
Then, Tino, could you please check your audio and video?
Yeah. Hi, Pramod.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you for joining
Hi,
us.
Constantino.
Do you see me and hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Avinash, sir.
Avinash.
Hi, good morning. I'm here.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you. Avinash, sir, Amit, sir, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Before that, I just want to say to all 3 panelists that as Professor Sangeeta Thapyal is not well, so she's not joining us. So you can take 20 minutes time. I got message yesterday night, so she's not well.
So we'll start in 2 minutes now.
Okay.
Well, I'm afraid I don't have enough to speak for 20 minutes. So if you don't mind, I'm happy to cede my time to my more learned colleagues.
Or maybe we can have more time on discussions.
Yeah, we can have more time on discussions.
Or they can speak for longer on my behalf.
Yes, I think maybe we can. So maybe we can have the initial round on the same time frame and then have more time on discussions.
Sure.
And we're following the order of the program. Is that right, Amit?
Yeah.
We're following the order of the program?
Yeah. She got a vaccine yesterday and then she got fever and nausea. So she said that she will not be able to.
So shall we start, sir?
Yeah.
Okay.
So can I go, Pramod?
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's start, Sunima.
Okay. So let's start.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the
relationship and discuss various aspects of
Amit
India.
sir, let me welcome you first. Amit sir, we'll start just a second.
Okay.
Okay, we'll start this.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is Connecting Nepal to the World, with the aim to bring the leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goals. This is the 18th session of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Amit Ranjan here with us. Dr. Amit Ranjan is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He has authored and edited several articles and books, including India-Bangladesh Border Disputes, History and Post-LBA Dynamics, India in South Asia Challenges and Management, and Partition of India, Post-Colonial Legacies. Without any further ado, I request the chair to take over.
So please take over.
Okay, thanks Pramod and thanks NICE. It's always my pleasure to participate in this global conference. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on India's-Nepal relations, which in recent past swung in a different direction. To understand this relationship and discuss various aspects of India's-Nepal relations, we have Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, and former Indian ambassador to Nepal. Dr. Constantino Xavier, fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi, and Dr. Avinash Godbole, associate professor at OP Jindal University, Sonipat. Each panelist will speak for 20 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. Now, without taking much of time, I would like to invite Ambassador Sood first to speak on the theme. Other than a speaker, everyone is requested to please mute their audio. Ambassador Sood, please take.
Thank you. Let me thank NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for inviting me to this conference. it was, I saw from the program that it has been a very intense 3 days, and I'm quite sure that the participants and the audiences have had a lot of food for thought. The title that we have today is about India's Nepal policy. And I think that, you know, instead of going into a historical kind of an evolution of India's Nepal policy, because I assume that many people are familiar with it, I think I will keep my remarks fairly short. I would like to first make a point that I think there is a certain myth making that seems to have been part of Nepal policy. Why do I say that? The reason I say that is because I see signs of that emerging from time to time. And the signs of that emerge because obviously the world is changing, the region is changing, so there is a transformation taking place. And naturally, therefore, there are certain myths that tend to confuse thinking or that tend to shape certain narratives, and politicians on both sides of the border tend to make use of those popular myth-created narratives and thereby whip up popular sentiments and so on to achieve their political objectives rather than looking at a normal India-Nepal relationship. We basically inherited the relationship with Nepal as Nepal had with British India. That's the first fact. Now, British India had a very different approach towards Nepal. The myth that was created, which is often found, is that, oh, Nepal, you know, has always been an independent country. India was colonized for centuries. Nepal resisted colonization and so on. And therefore, in some sense, there is a feeling that there is the sovereignty and independence of Nepal has been a long-standing attribute. Why I mention this, not that there is anything wrong with it, but where it ends up creating a difficulty is because the sovereignty issue or the territorial integrity issue often becomes a very touchy issue. And as I'm sure all of you know, and I'll give one or two examples. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time, as I said. So the fact is that yes, Nepal was not colonized, but also it is an equally important fact that Nepal's sovereignty was severely constrained by the British, to the extent that the British wanted to control Nepal's foreign policy and security policy. They did it quite happily by having a political agent. That part is unfortunately forgotten in Nepali history very often, or in Nepali narrative. So the fact is that Nepal had a constrained sovereignty right from the Treaty of Subali. Number one. Number two, I think we, as a newly independent country, inherited that relationship. And now I come to the next big sort of myth that exists, which is about the 1950 treaty, because fairly soon after independence, the 1950 treaty was concluded between India and Nepal, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And there is a common misperception, shall I say, that this is a treaty that was pushed by India in some fashion or the other. In fact, India was clueless about this treaty, more or less, because we had a series of treaties prior to that between India and Nepal, which we inherited. A new treaty that was signed, which was a trilateral treaty between Britain, Nepal and the newly emerging Republic of India was related to the Gurkha recruitment. And it was done primarily because the Gurkha regiments had a recruitment from Nepal, and the Gurkha regiments obviously were divided between Britain and India. Obviously, as Hindus, the Gurkhas were not, Gurkha regiments could not go to Pakistan, as happened with the many of the other British Indian Army troops who were, and officers who were given choices. So in this particular case, we had a trilateral agreement which was signed in 1947, and that continued. We did not disband the Gurkha regiments. I mean, part of the reason is that we did not disband the British Indian Army as we inherited it. We did not disband the Indian civil service as we inherited it, because it was in that sense, well, quote unquote, peaceful, but a peaceful, if you want to use that, despite the violence that was associated with partition and all the rest of it, it was a peaceful transition of power from the departing colonial power to the newly emerging republic. However, in 1947, with the takeover, with the Maoist revolution in China, there was certainly, and then the Chinese coming into the Maoist taking over in Tibet, there was a growing concern among the Rana regime, and who felt that they needed the similar kind of arrangement with independent India as they had with British India. So in fact, there were a number of proposals that were suggested as to how we could consolidate the various treaties that had existed with regard to the open border, with regard to trade and transit, with regard to the 1923 treaty, which had been the successor of the various treaties. And eventually this then led to the 1950 treaty. The 1950 treaty, as we know, has become a kind of a rod to beat the governments with. And for the last many years, for more than 20 years, India has expressed willingness. There are various joint statements at the level of prime ministers' visits and things like that, which indicate that both sides agreed to review and update the 1950 treaty. And yet, there has been no attempt at updating the 1950 treaty. Each time an attempt has been made, the thing is that, well, we would do it at a subsequent date, because after all, somewhere when you start looking at this, both sides have to do a certain amount of homework. Which brings me to my third point, that both sides have found it either out of maybe intellectual inertia, or maybe out of political convenience, maybe out of benefits, or whatever it is, have found it convenient to continue with the 1950 treaty as it is, despite for the more than 20 years, as I said, almost every single prime ministerial visit has a paragraph in the joint statement indicating that both countries have agreed to update and review, and at the next round of foreign secretary level talks, this will be taken up. However, it has never been taken up to the best of my knowledge. Perhaps, I mean, since we are looking at think tanks, this is a think tank event. Maybe if governments have been somewhat reluctant, perhaps think tanks might undertake a project of doing a cost-benefit analysis to India and to Nepal, objectively, if possible, and see whether who gains, who loses, what are the elements, because there are a number of related elements. And what happens with this is that this also, the irritants of the 1950 treaty show up time and time again in the bilateral relationship, because as I said, sovereignty is a touchy subject. third point I want to make is that the Nepal has been, I would say, since about 1919, since the first Jan Andolan, according to me, Nepal has been in a political transition. You know, after the first Jan Andolan, there was a new constitution that came into being. Incidentally, Nepal has had a number of constitutions since 1948. The 1948 constitution was the one that was proclaimed by Prime Minister Padma Shamsher Rana, but was never actually implemented because he got overthrown. Then there was an interim constitution in 1951, and this was then replaced in 1959, amended, which gave enhanced powers to King Mahendra. And then subsequently, in 1962, there was the Panchayati Raj constitution that was adopted. And then finally, there came a multi-party democracy in 1990, then an interim constitution in 2008, and finally, the new constitution, which establishes Nepal, which abolishes monarchy and establishes Nepal as a republic, as a federal republic in 2015. So Nepal has experimented with different kinds of constitutions and different kinds of political systems. So, but I would say that the transition from about 1990 onwards has been more or less a continuous transition, because I think no prime minister has actually lasted for a long enough time. I mean, you know, there have been constant changes. After 1990, there was a period of stability. After the elections, again, we have seen that Prime Minister Oli has continued for the last 2.5 years. But I think we'd all know that his tenure has also not been trouble-free. And partly the first 2 years were relatively quiet because the new constitution prohibits no confidence vote or any such thing in the first 2 years of the term. And this is, mind you, after he had a near 2/3 majority. So this is a political transition that has continued, which has obviously indicates an absence of political stability in Nepal. Add to this the changes in the region that have taken place, and very clearly this is the rise of China, and therefore, while I think every neighbor of India is playing the non-alignment card between India and China, and Nepal is no exception. And Nepal is perfectly, it is a perfectly legitimate activity to try and play non-aligned between India and China. I mean, I don't see any difficulty with that, but I do think that what has happened in the process is that there is an element that becomes, because there are so many myths that surround our relationship, therefore, it leads to irritants coming up and sometimes quite baseless things. I mean, we've seen the kind of riots that took place when there was a Hrithik Roshan movie, or we've seen the kind of riots that have taken place about, the birthplace of Buddha, or whether it is here. We've seen claims about Ayodhya being in Nepal or being in India, and all the rest of it. I mean, yes, we perhaps as scholars, or we perhaps as diplomats or whatever, can smile about it, but still the fact remains that these instances are used to whip up public emotions, and they have led to riots in the past. I mean, an innocent statement by I think it was Madhuri Dixit, who said that, oh, I feel very much at home here, was kind of twisted around to say, oh, this is a sign of Indian expansionism, much as Nepal would like to claim Madhuri Dixit as one of their own, I'm sure. Or I remember when I was there, there was a particular film which was otherwise a completely eminently forgettable film. I don't even think most people have seen it, called Chandni Chowk to China. And it was released, and in that some character at some point says, I come from the land of Buddha. Buddha was born in India. Don't you know that? Or some such thing he says to the other fellow who's a Chinese. Now, that particular sentence obviously led to, boycotts of India and demonstrations and things like that. And this happened, as I said, this happened sometime when I was there, maybe 2010 or 2011 or something like that. I mean, it finally, we had to get an apology from the producer, who was quite oblivious of anything that had happened. I mean, he said, well, what the hell? I mean, I don't know. Somebody's written this dialogue, it is there. Who cares? I mean, but it took a lot of doing from the embassy to find out who the director or the producer was, get an apology, put it out there, etc., etc. I mean, meanwhile, there was a boycott for Indian films. There was a protest demonstration, a dharna outside the Indian embassy. Stones were thrown at Air India offices or State Bank of India offices. People needed security. This kind of nonsense. So I think what has happened is that these kind of sentimental issues are often thrown up because of the myths that tend to surround the relationship. And what it does is that while in the past, India was certainly Nepal's principal economic partner in terms of economic cooperation, assistance programs, etc., etc. Today, Nepal has a choice, and which is fine. China is very happy and willing to come and make highways and airports and set up power plants and so on and so on. I mean, and I think that this also shows up India in poor light, because many of our projects take a long time. Now, our projects in Nepal take about the same kind of time that they take in India, maybe sometimes a little longer. But but the Chinese have shown that they can do these things much faster, and so naturally there is a certain attraction. Well, I mean, the fact that there may be certain costs associated with it is something that perhaps is more for the Nepalese to be able to figure out than for India to try and tell the Nepalese about. And I think we should refrain from that. So I think both sides are guilty about allowing these myths to continue, which ends up spoiling the relationship and creates unnecessary irritants instead of moving towards a more open and a more normalized kind of a relationship. There is a tendency to take recourse to the usual cliches of roti beti ka rishta and all the rest of it, which from Janakpur to Ayodhya, tourism circuits and all the rest of it. But the fact is that in reality, we have not been able to see much economic progress. We've not been able to see the hydel power exploitation, for example, which could have benefited both the countries. I remember once the late Nepali political leader, Krishna Prasad Bhattarai, and he and the former Indian Prime Minister Chandrasekhar was Prime Minister for a short period and had also close ties with Nepal, and at a conversation where they were talking, and this is saying that no, now maybe we need to open a new chapter and all the rest of it. And at some point, I think it was mentioned that if we keep waiting for electricity to be generated in Nepal and then be transmitted to India, and as they said, aap bhi andhere mein rahenge, hum bhi andhere mein rahenge. So I think that that unfortunate reality has not changed, because in the last 21 years, I still think that, I mean, I'm told that Arun 3 is making progress, but despite the fact that there were more than 21 exploratory licenses issued, only Arun 3 is the one which is supposedly making progress. None of the others have taken off, and other major projects which were signed, let's say, even when the now Prime Minister Oli, it was signed during his time in the mid-1990s, the Pancheshwar Agreement and so on. Nothing has happened. So I think there is a tendency that we have allowed this relationship to drift, but I don't think it is in our interest to allow it to drift any longer, because I think the downside of letting it drift is much too great. So we need to do, as I said, both sides need to engage in a bit of a soul searching and in a bit of a cost benefit analysis, honest to themselves. I mean, the Nepalese side should be able to look at the 1950 treaty and its associated things, whether it is the open border, whether it is the, the right to work in India, whether it is rupee peg, the trade, normalize, open border for movement of people, movement of goods, all the rest of it. And India should look at the advantages that it gets out of the 1950 treaty in terms of, the shared cultural ties. And the cultural ties are not going to go away. I mean, the linguistic ties, cultural ties, etc., are not going to go away. So I don't see that as necessarily, but that cannot be. I think the governments have to go beyond the cliches to be able to set the relationship in a slightly more modern idiom, because I think the relationship has still been held hostage to a certain past, which perhaps Nepal has never wanted to honestly acknowledge. Thank you. I think I've spoken long enough, and back to you.
Thank you, sir. You have rightly mentioned. And there's one more backlash which I want to point out. That was when Manisha Koirala, the famous Bollywood actress from Nepal, she talked about, she wrote something on Twitter about India-Nepal boundary, and there was a lots of backlash.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah. So it's,
I mean, the boundary issue is so recent, and as you know, I have written a paper for ISAS on that issue. So I therefore did not go into that. But that again is a reflection of the same myth making. I mean, something that we allowed it to linger unnecessarily. Till it became, if you allow things to linger unnecessarily, then sooner or later it is going to become infectious. And that's exactly what happened with that whole Lipu Lake and all the rest of it.
Thanks, sir. And about 1950 treaty, I just have a question, and which you can respond later on before we start with the question and answer session. It is more more to do with the Nepalese politics, because there are Indian scholars who has written that they talk about it, but when it comes to formal negotiation on table, ministry between the ministries or between the officials, it just they say that no, this is not on the agenda, or they just backtrack. So it's doing more internal politics than with the external. My second question would be that when Sushma Swaraj was there, and I was at ICWA at that point of time, and in one of her speech, and in fact KP Oli was prime minister, and he's just visited in 2015, I think, and she said that no, we are not big brothers, we are trying to become elder brothers. So do you think that India has transformed itself from being a big brother, which other neighbors, including Nepal, accuse, to elder brother? You can answer later on, sir. After,
you want
can
me
answer
to
later.
this big brother elder brother, these kind of cliches reflect that we are again taking recourse to our cultural ties.
Yeah.
And I think that while those are good, and that gives us a certain ability to talk to each other and understand each other because we share certain common cultural traits. But I think that in terms of actual negotiations, we need to go beyond that. That cannot be the touchstone of negotiation. So the touchstone of negotiation, as I said, it has to be a simple cost-benefit analysis. And you are right when you say that even though for 25 years, we have been talking about reviewing and updating it, the 1950 treaty, we have not done so for the simple reason that each time, because before that, a certain amount of homework needs to be done by both sides. I mean, different ministries, different departments of the government of Nepal and different departments of the government of India need to come together to analyze the 1950 treaty, to see what they get, what they give, and then do their own cost-benefit analysis, and then they share it across the table and say, look, this, and say that, okay, this is what we don't like today. I mean, like, for example, the huge hue and cry about these secret side letters of the 1950 treaty. It's a non-entity.
Yeah.
Those secret side letters, first, are no longer secret. I mean, they are there in the public domain. And secondly, they are not observed. They have not been observed since the mid-1980s. So what is the big deal? But yet, the secret side letters and therefore its relationship or infringement of sovereignty becomes a convenient rod to use for, whipping up nationalism. So I think what is needed is to go beyond the cliches of elder brother and big brother, things like that, and actually do a more, this is something which is not going to be done at a political level. This is obviously something that is going to be done at an official level and will require a certain degree of coordination among different departments and of the governments on both sides. And then once each side has done its homework, then they will sit and they will discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to invite Constantino, Xavier, to speak on connectivity between India and Nepal. Dr. Constantino, please.
Thank you, Amit, and the Institute for South Asian Studies is partnering with the session. And thank you to Pramod and his wonderful team at NICE in Kathmandu and all over that is hosting this. Real pleasure to be here today on this panel. It's, I think, a great, timely, and relevant panel because it just strikes at the heart of the issue, which is how little India knows about Nepal, how little Nepal knows about India. And I think, like Ambassador Sood emphasized, we need, I think, an updated approach to this relationship, new lenses to study it, to analyze it, a new commitment, a new momentum from decision makers, from political leaders on both sides. So this is certainly a very welcome move from NICE to have a dedicated panel on India-Nepal relations, something that has kept me busy also over the years. And I want to start where Ambassador Sood has ended, and he's made my job easy because he's given us a really wonderful, I think, tour de table and over the last few decades of the relationship, of the ups and downs, of the parameters in which this relationship was set in stone in the past, in the pre-independence past for India, in the 1950s and onwards, and how those stones in which those letters and this relationship has been set in the 1950s are now, I think, being eroded. And it's difficult to even understand what has been set in stone, because the times have changed, the geography has changed, the landscape has changed. And I welcome, I think, what Ambassador Sood has said in terms of the lack of utility of certain myths, of certain cliches, of certain preconceived ideas, or certain ossified, completely outdated ideas that have lingered on, unfortunately, until this year, 2021, where I think we're stuck on, completely irrelevant concepts, ideas, perceptions on both sides of the border and in both countries. So I think that was a timely refresher from Ambassador Sood, and I'll try to, in the same vein, explain that, in my view, from a macro view, you have two things happening these days. You have, in terms of what I call hard connectivity, think of it as bridges, roads, railway, water, energy, etc. You have on hard connectivity, finally, after decades, I think, of neglect on both sides, but particularly on the Indian side, given that it's a bigger country, has, I think, a naturally long-term interest you would expect as a regional power to promote the hard connectivity agenda. That on that hard connectivity agenda, you've had a huge gap emerging, and that is now being corrected over the last few years, since the 2000s, very slowly and timidly, too late, far too slow, and now has been accelerating over the last few years. So that is on the hard connectivity, wiring between, actual material built connectivity, which is the precondition for us to have any relationship and foreign policy discussion. But we cannot talk about foreign policy as a think of geostrategy, of balancing, of alignments, of treaties, of papers, of promises, of special relationships, unless it is backed up by hard material, economic, infrastructural, mobility, interdependence between two states. And today the tragedy is that if you go to Delhi and Kathmandu, and for the last few years, and unfortunately still happens, when we talk about the India-Nepal relationship, we immediately shift into the high gear of macro geostrategic analysis, and we forget what is happening at the most important level, which is a second level I'm going to discuss today, which is the soft connectivity side of it. The soft connectivity means flows between people, visions, ideas, migration, education, foreign policy sort of visions and alignments, political contact between leaderships, between political parties, students crossing the border to study on each side of the border, for example, engagements between think tanks, as we're having here today, for example, with representatives also from India and from Nepal discussing. On that front, on that soft connectivity front, that's why I like Ambassador Sood's expression of myths and cliches. These two countries are not as connected as we think. And in fact, I would say that because of decades of neglect on the hard connectivity front between these two countries, that is now being corrected. That takes time, there's a lag, but because of those decades, we are still going in different directions on the soft connectivity side. So let me give you an example. If you build a bridge between two villages, and I think it's being finally built now. Let's give you an example between India and Nepal. The roads are being built. We're talking about railway connectivity. We're talking about river connectivity. There's a lot happening on that front. Very good success in the last few years. I would say more than ever in 20, 30 years before. If you look at that bridge being built between two villages, it will take time for those people in both those villages to use that bridge and start moving across that bridge, to marry, to talk to each other, to get to know each other, to reconnect at the level of the soft connectivity of the mind and of all those other soft indicators. So there's a lag. Even if you build a bridge, and I would say the bridge is no way ready still, but some bridges have been built between India and Nepal over the last few years, physical bridges in that sense, between two villages. Once you have that bridge built, there's still a lag between the bridge having been built and being open to circulation, and the effects that is going to have on both communities on both sides to gravitate their thinking, their visions, their movements towards each other. So I would say today we have built a few bridges finally, or we are still building some, but the gap of the two communities is still going in different directions. That gap is growing, even though the physical hard connectivity gap is being closed. And that's why we're seeing the gravity of the political crises, for example, including the one last year on the border dispute, flaring up as never before in the history of India-Nepal relations. It is correct that we've had many crises before in the past, that there are interests on both sides that have politicized crises. That for me is a constant in the relationship. But the severity of that crisis last year speaks to that the divergence between India and Nepal at the soft connectivity dimension, that is in a simplistic way put it like that, but basically of the mind between both societies and both countries. So I think that gap needs to be closed. The lag, I think, finally is being closed, but it's going to take time. And as long as we don't do essential progress on the hard connectivity front, we will not be correcting the diagnosis, I think, that Ambassador Sood rightly did, that you have structural divergence between those countries at the sort of invisible dimensions. And in that sense, let me give you an example of something last year that I thought was particularly positive. Despite the severity of the crisis in the Kalapani border dispute last year, that really disrupted relations at the most elementary level between both states for several weeks, months probably, depending on how you look at it, but where you had really a breakdown in relations and communications at multiple levels. And this, let's not forget, it is a very well wired relationships. You have many, links and levels in the India-Nepal relationship. It's not only between prime ministers, between the diplomatic establishment. There are many, many levels. I like to say that India has, often one vision for Nepal and one Nepal policy, but also several sub-policies towards Nepal, depending on who you talk to in Delhi. You have the defense establishment, which has its own often views or different points of view. That's normal, but there's many approaches to Nepal. On all those levels, the relationship broke down last year. And my view is what happened, which was positive though, last year, if you notice, is that despite that, both countries agreed to continue fleshing out the hard connectivity agenda and the development cooperation agenda between India and Nepal. So even in June, July, August last year, if you look at the Ministry of External Affairs statements, if you even look at the Nepali government statements, the projects were continuing on the ground to correct this humongous connectivity gap that legacy of the last few decades has left us with. And that was positive because it meant that Kathmandu and Delhi and the establishment also realized that even if things are not looking right on the political, geostrategic, security, whatever you want to call it front, both countries are committed to continue working towards correcting that essential infrastructural gap between India and Nepal. And that for me was a very positive development, a very mature, I think, from both sides. India had all the reasons to say we're going to put this on hold too, to use it as leverage against Nepal, but it would of course be self-defeating, that's my view, but it had at least that vision to keep that apart. And same on Nepal. Nepal could have been tempted to say, let's stop this because we're upset at India. We're going to use this to signal our discontent. But credit in that sense to the Nepali bureaucratic decision-making, possibly also political establishment to understand that that would continue whatever happens on the political front. So let's quickly examine the hard and soft connectivity fronts. On a hard connectivity front, what I would say is today, if you look at trade and investments, it has come down. It is abysmal given the potential of what you would expect between those two economies still, but it's being corrected. It is not a coincidence that Nepal reached a record number of exports in 1920, even in some of the months of the pandemic, because of the ease of logistics that India has facilitated for Nepali products now to access digitized containers, to access India's railway network, and access India's ports. So that is looking better, but it's still a gap that is phenomenal on trade and investments. If you look at Indian companies investing in Nepal, it is puzzling how next door Nepal, an economy that has a huge potential, there are not more Indian foreign investors, big companies, medium companies, investing in the Nepali market. You would expect that from such a big economy like India. Water and rivers, right? Finally now we have discussing a protocol for inland water navigation and trade between India and Nepal. Should have happened decades ago, right? But finally there's some progress on that. But look again at the potential and how little still has been done, basically nothing, but there is a progress now to at least flesh it out, the rules to do it. And I think certain protocols have been signed on 1 or 2 rivers to allow for trade. Electricity, I think Ambassador Sood mentioned. Bizarre that Nepal over the last few years has been importing electricity from Nepal, from India, when it's one of the largest, sitting on the largest hydropower potential in the world and still not developed properly. Look at rail connectivity. As of today, we still don't have a single passenger rail link. You cannot take a train as a passenger between any point in India and Nepal. I mean, I don't have to think of more examples to tell you how that is just abysmal and surprising, that you cannot, take a train from Delhi to Kathmandu, a fast speed train, right? Forget Delhi to Kathmandu, you cannot take a train from Patna onwards to the Terai in southern Nepal, right? I think now finally they're being built over the last years. I think the passenger rail link is about to be inaugurated. The freight train also. I think India's laid 2 lines now. But again, given what you should have by now, and you're racing against time now to correct that. Look at airports. Last year I was in Janakpur. To come to Delhi, I had to fly to Kathmandu. Why is there not a direct flight from Janakpur, for example, airport to Delhi or to Patna? And that, I think, tells you again, the air connectivity is abysmal. Here again, Nepal has pushed for more routes. For the last 20 years, Nepal has been asking for more routes, for more slots, and there's been consistent problems on both sides also, but particularly on the Indian side, to be responsive to that need. And still here we are today, connecting from any point in Nepal, first to Kathmandu to come to any point in India. Look at roads. I did a project last year with my colleague Riya Sinha looking at many road building projects in southern Nepal, and the abysmal level of road connectivity still between Bihar, UP, and southern Nepal. You should be smoothly able to drive up to Kathmandu today from any point in North India. If we are really in 2021, and if you look at the world economy around you and what other regions have achieved. Look at telecom and data. You have the new data links being set between Nepal and China. The data links that have been, on which the Nepal-India relationship operates today have been laid in the 1990s and have not been updated. Outdated, clogged, unable to cater to anything that would be a future strategic vision of India-Nepal relations based on, for example, quick, good data flow on telecommunications networks between India and Nepal. So the gap is being closed. That's my point here. But it's phenomenal how big that gap is, right? And let's keep that in mind as a reality check as we talk of India-Nepal relationship. At least I learn a lot whenever I go close to that border and see for myself the state of affairs on that border, right? We could talk also on integrated checkposts that are now finally being built. I think there are 2 now operational. I visited one last year in Biratnagar. Phenomenal, big scale border control halls on the India-Nepal border with an Indian grant. The mirror infrastructure has been built on the Biratnagar side, on the Nepali side. But you should have by now, that is my view, by my estimate, you should have by now maybe 10 of these, 15 of these along the India-Nepal border, right? But here we are still building, the last 2 have been inaugurated over the last few years now, a few more in the making, but that is the challenge. On soft connectivity, we love to say the relationship is so special, right? So close, so connected. But look at society today. And here again, you see it last year. Look at the perceptions of Nepalis of India today. Look at and compare that to the perceptions the Nepalis would have on average in the 1950s and 60s of India. And if you compare that, it'll give you a good idea how India has lost its relative salience, visibility, and influence today compared to what it had in the 1950s. If you talk to probably young Nepalis at that point, where they wanted to study, where they would look for inspiration, political inspiration, economic model inspiration, educational opportunities, just overall that view, I think will tell you that. Look at the Terai and the Madhesh. I was surprised. We talk so much about the Madheshis being inclined towards India or having a special relationship with India. or feeling close to India, the roti-beti relationship Ambassador Sood mentioned, right? Marrying across that border, sharing linguistic, ethnic, social affiliations in many ways in a long history. I was puzzled engaging with people at the provincial level in their governments, politicians, planners, bureaucrats, academics, small think tanks, how India does not figure in their discussions. In terms of ties, in terms of meetings to their counterparts on the Indian side, sometimes Patna, UP figures a little bit there, but how many of those people know what's happening in Delhi, have good, for example, if you talk about little, educational institutions in the Madhya, universities and think tanks, how much are they actually engaged in engagements, meetings, exchanges with their counterpart education institutions or think tanks, for example, in India? I was surprised that actually I was expecting a very different India. It was an India of the mind, I would say almost a medieval India, a cultural mind. Yes, you marry maybe across, you have cousins across, you eat the same food, but that is not modern connectivity in terms of people looking across the border for inspiration, for movement, for ideas, for counterparts to fulfill development. Look at issues like political connectivity even. If you look at the number of provinces-wise chief ministers that have visited India, I would like to see that number. How many chief ministers of the Nepali provinces and members of those new provincial assemblies have visited on official visits India? How many of India's MPs have visited Nepal in the last 10 to 20 years? How many MLAs from the state provinces bordering Nepal from the state assemblies bordering Nepal have visited Nepal on official relationships? And I can tell you for sure that it's less than ever, and if you look at proportionally to previous decades, right? That gives you another indicator of soft connectivity and how you engage. Look at education and students. Last year we did a study looking at where Nepali, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi students are studying when they go abroad. And it shouldn't surprise us now that Nepali students are going to China as much as they're going to India, despite the distance, despite many other difficulties, the linguistic difficulties. They're going more to China and many other destinations too, Japan, Australia, etc. So that also tells you about the divergence. Look at United Nations voting patterns. We've done a study on how Nepal and India vote at the UNGA on many issues. A clear divergence and gap showing up on many issues. Foreign policy visions towards, for example, critical issues like Hong Kong or Tibet. Look at the Nepali response last year. Look at India's response last year. Look at the military to military relationship. I mean, very important relationship. And I'm not going to discard it in any way. Very strong defense establishments on both sides, connected in many ways. But if you look at also what Nepal is doing these days, for example, 3 years ago, its first joint military exercise with the People's Liberation Army of China, it tells you also again that there's some fissures there, or some different, diversification of views on both sides. Even religion, we love to say these days that there's a great religious connection between India and Nepal. Nepal is a Hindu majority country. I mean, everyone that has done a bit of sociological, anthropological reading about Nepal knows how diverse Nepal's Hinduism is, how diverse Nepal's religions even are beyond Hinduism, and how there's very different perceptions, not forgetting on where Rama was born or not, which then come up, but certainly very different perceptions on the ground of how religion or spiritualism plays out in both these countries. It's far more complex than two monolith Hindu countries that somehow have a special relationship just because they share a certain idea of faith. I think that is quite actually limited in its adherence if you look at both societies. So I'll end at that, and I'll just then therefore leave you with this question of how connected these two countries are. The good news is that on the hard connectivity, there's more progress than ever before. My question is only, why has it taken so long for Nepal and India, in particular India, to finally push through the hard connectivity agenda, on which we're seeing these successes today over the last few years? And still that we will have to be very patient and careful about the soft connectivity gap actually growing over the next, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. That will be the gap and the lag that we will expect, I think, still until we have a new generation in Nepal and in India ready to sort of really look at each other with a much more productive, constructive, future-oriented agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Constantino, for your wonderful presentation on connectivity. And with coming of China, there's a competition between India and China is going very step on infrastructure projects, and also Nepal is looking beyond India for connectivity. So we don't know that how feasible that will be, but still they are looking for. Now I would like to ask Dr. Avinash to speak on India, China, and Nepal. Dr. Avinash.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Institute and Nias, for inviting me to be part of this panel. The last two presentations, one by Ambassador Rakesh and the other by Tino, in a way have been kind of contrasting approaches. One is kind of glass half full on how things are, but Tino reminding what more needs to be done in case of and what gaps are there in case of India-Nepal relations. Now, I'm not an expert on Nepal, but I study China's foreign policy. And for last few months, I have initiated a project on China's neighborhood policy. And I thought this presentation or reading up for this would go well with that work. So here I am. So I'm going to be setting up my presentation in terms of 4 ideas. One is principles of foreign policy, and the triangularity between China, Nepal, and India. The second is interests, whose interests are getting fulfilled, and what kind of balance of power are we getting to achieve. The third principle is sovereignty, and the perception that Nepal is able to balance India's repeated interferences in quotes by getting closer to China. I have doubts whether that is happening, and we'll speak a little bit on that. And the fourth principle is of that prosperity, whether the concept of shared prosperity, on the basis of which Nepal appears to be getting closer to China, is really happening on the basis of the development in the last few months, especially the blockade of Nepal-China trade that no one really talks about compared to the India-China trade, the India-Nepal blockade, unofficial blockade of 2015, which in any case was wrong. Now let me get into this little discussion points by points. And I really want to go back to the little bit of theory of whether China's foreign policy in Asia and whether its neighborhood policy is based on principles or whether it's based on interest. Now, realism is the foundation of world order. There's no denying that, and power is the currency of realist order, as cliched as that statement might be. But it operates in reality in case of China's foreign policy. And to my mind, there are 3 or 4 case studies where China's power operates strongly to fulfill its interest ahead of its principles of foreign policy in its neighborhood. One of the case studies being the Philippines, the way China has toyed with the bilateral relations before and after the ruling on the South China Sea. The second being Mongolia on the issue of coal and on the issue of ethnic interest and the extreme dependence on China for trade. And third, I think, is Nepal, the way the relationship seems to have evolved. The second principle on this debate between principles of foreign policy versus interest-based foreign policy is that the weaker countries talk of principle-based foreign policy. These are our principles, these are ideals for world order, world peace, harmony, and all of that. But the great powers and emerging powers first work out their interest and then sugarcoat it on the basis of principles to make it more benign, to make it appear more friendly. And I'm sure none of the people attending this conference have a doubt that China has moved that line of power in a certain manner, where it's able to present its interests in terms of principles. The mutually beneficial cooperation or the win-win strategy becomes the principle, but the interests get fulfilled more strongly there. Now, one of the more oft heard cliches of or the criticisms of India's approach to Nepal vis-a-vis China is that India is too much preoccupied, or Indian scholarship analyzes China's interest in Nepal too much centered on the presence of Tibetans in exile in Nepal, and we should get out of that hangover or that preoccupation, so to speak. But why is it that the principal Chinese aid to Nepalese armed forces goes to the paramilitary, which is preeminently present in Kathmandu, and which is what controls, which is what managed to control the protest by the Tibetans in exile there over the last few years? I mean, this has been happening since 2014, the training of paramilitary forces and all of that. So once again, a capacity building exercise on part of China, but getting its interest fulfilled in Nepal of controlling the activities of Tibetans in exile there. Also, the first section itself in this brilliant book by Amish Rajmulmi on the present state of triangularity of India-China-Nepal relations, he talks of that incident where a Tibetan origin US citizen was sent back from the Kathmandu airport on the basis of his name being similar to someone else who was a press officer of the Tibetan government in exile, without adequate verification, etc. This incident happened a few years ago. Once again, incidents like these, and these are not isolated incidents, these are incidents, there are multiple incidents of this nature. If the Chinese support and the power play balancing by Nepal is getting Nepal to do such kind of activities, what kind of sovereignty does it leave for Nepal to act in its own interest, or was it even there? Then the next set of ideas on China's South Asia policy often often mention that China's South Asia policy should not be viewed from Indian perspective, that India should step out of its perception of India's centrality and then look at how China is approaching countries in South Asia. But realism and realist understanding will tell you that that is not necessarily the case. The stepping out is necessary. It can only be an exercise of convenience, so to speak, to my mind, because most of China's activities in South Asia are concerned with India's rise as a power and extending its sphere of influence in the South Asian neighborhood. There are several influences of that. As Constantino mentioned, I had seen this point somewhere in the discussion, China's monetary influence and investment influence also gets it support in the United Nations when the voting matters. That pattern has been seen previously in Africa, where and Latin America, where isolation of Taiwan was concerned. But in the last few years, we are seeing that pattern in South Asia as well. Not just in case of Pakistan's behavior, but in case of behavior of other countries as well. Now, the second point of this, the trade blockade that Nepal did experience, and I mentioned that not many people have spoken about. Not only Nepal's exports to China have suffered in the COVID and post-COVID period, which a brilliant friend and ambassador recently called it as the worst export of China to the world. But also Nepal's imports from China suffered surprisingly in this last 1 year, especially since last October, Till April, there have been several news of imports from China suffering, and traders and businessmen in Nepal suffering because of that, again, undeclared blockade and the slowing down of trucks transport between China and Nepal. Now, there are 2 or 3 elements included in this. This is not the imagination of shared prosperity that anyone has when we talk of Nepal getting more options of development coming from China. Cash and carry trade is not going to create a prosperity. Cash and carry trade is not going to create more wealth within a country. It will only create more short-term trading opportunities, but also suppress the domestic manufacturing capacity of whatever it was there previously. Cash and carry trade is also not going to help countries like Nepal or India, for that matter, address the concerns of inequality, access, inequalities of income, inequalities of regions and provinces, and income inequalities. Our ideas of development are have been rather more inclusive. No matter China has changed the terms of trade and investment in Asia, but there's a realization, I think, after this recent blockade that this kind of unequal trade is not sustainable. So what is going to happen of such cash and carry trade, and where is the future of that? That is a question for Nepal to answer for itself, and then talk and sign its trade deals in a more mature and more equitable manner involving India and China. Now, as I say this, I'm not saying that the previously signed deals are completely one-sided or hurriedly done on part of Nepal, but I'm sure there's some kind of analysis going on in the Nepali strategic and economic minds right now. In addition, the trans-Himalayan trade networks, at what cost is it going to be built? What is the benefit that Nepal is going to get in terms of, again, employment generation, in terms of extending its role in value-added chains, etc., and so on. We need to think of these questions in a more clear and a more open mind. Sovereignty and prosperity questions are linked, and these questions cannot be dealt with by one-sided trade agreements that speak of win-win strategies but are not so of that nature. My last point in this initial discussion is that the clear backdrop to Nepal's warmed or re-warmed relations with India in October, and those several visits that happened since then, 3 one after another, we all know the details, was the news in September that several buildings were constructed by China on the Nepalese side of the border, at least 8 or 9 of those, and that created that strategic uncertainty and distress for Nepal. And I think there is also certain awareness from what I've seen in the media that the trade prosperity and strategic instability are coming hand in hand by these engagements from Nepal. So this kind of situation for Nepal, where this economic opportunity is which was seen as a positive thing, or as a role of balancing of its own interest between India and China, is it pushing Nepal in some ways to take unviable positions, and the short-term switching of positions and somersaults, so to speak, and the viability of all that? Those are the bigger things to consider. And as we heard from Ambassador Sood and Constantino, the China threat perception of its role in Nepal, etc., the way it was being projected 8 or 10 years ago, perhaps, is kind of more appears more manageable now, but still the interference aspect in various fields of Nepalese and other countries, media, for example, those issues cannot be ignored. The issues of United Front work department getting active, getting more active, rather not just active in South Asia, and those concerns cannot get ignored. And I'll simply conclude this by simply reiterating one of the earlier points, that you cannot wish the Tibet question away while looking at the China, Nepal, India triangularity. That question will be there. And we need a more stronger, more nuanced understanding of that Tibet question as well. Wishing it away is not going to take that question away anytime soon. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, Avinash, sir. And if you look at the COVID-19 situation, and during this phase, start from 2019 April itself to till date, China is one of the major influencer. It has gained much more space in South Asia and influencing India's neighborhood policy much more than what India. Although Mr. Modi started with SAARC India meeting, talking about how to deal with this COVID situation. However, second wave came and India itself, under lots of pressure. So China just moved in, and now it's in May or June, first week, China had a meeting with Chinese foreign minister, had a meeting with the South Asian foreign minister. It was a third meeting, and pushing lots of money and everything. So, and then politically also China, the meeting of Chinese ambassador to Nepal, during this political thaw between the two factions of the government. So it was like, China is moving much more resources within in Nepal than what it earlier used to be. So there's always a thing that, okay, so India may lose influence. There's a feeling in New Delhi, but let's see how the things turn up now. Now the floor is open for questions and answers. Actually, I have received lots of questions for Ambassador Sood, and there are 5 to 6, but I have shortened it. There are also statements which I am not going to, and opinions. So I'm not going to take those opinions. I have shortened the questions. And Ambassador Sood, these questions are specifically for Ambassador Sood. You too also can join if you feel so. So the first question to you is that India is undermining Nepal's sovereignty after 1947. What do you think about it? Then the second question is on Indian media's role and how it portrayed Nepal, especially during this boundary dispute time, and making meme of Chinese ambassador to Nepal, talking about Nepalese Prime Minister KP Oli. And then there's a question on why India wants to influence Nepal's politics. The fourth question to Ambassador Sood is, what is the fate of EPG? Then there is an opinion which I find it interesting, about which Ambassador Sood talked, that India still sees Nepal from eyes of colonial power and not as a sovereign country. So Ambassador Sood, would you like to go ahead? I have 2 more questions to add. So for you, so please respond to these 5 questions, and then I will ask 2 more questions, which some of our audience has asked for you. Yep.
Thank you. As I pointed out very clearly, India did not have any sovereignty before 1947. So where is the question of comparison or any such thing? Your questioner has said, if Nepal had constrained sovereignty, then India had zero sovereignty. I have no hesitation in acknowledging it. We were colonized.
No, after the 1947.
So, yes, so after 1947, that's why I said that it was basically, this is a continuation. The fact is that Nepal, because of its particular geography, because of its domestic politics, about which I think sure my Nepali friends know much more, has sought to have a similar relationship with independent India. Now, independent India had obviously very different worldview as compared to British India. So British India did not give a damn. As in 1947, there were 13 graduates in Nepal. As far as British India was concerned, they didn't bother whether there were 13 or maybe even 3 graduates in Nepal. But for India to inherit that relationship and then have an open border and then get a 1950 treaty which more or less provided a similar kind of a relationship was a very different ballgame. I think both sides probably made an error. However, the only way to rectify that error is you can't go back and rewrite history. So the only way you can do that is by updating the treaty. That is all. So there is really no point in saying that India is interested in micromanaging. India has zero interest in micromanaging Nepal's politics. We can't handle our own domestic politics. Why would we want to micromanage Nepal's politics? I think Nepalese, you know, when I was posted there, Nepal was in the middle of drafting its constitution and things like that. So wherever I went, you know, people would say, you know, Ambassador Saab, why don't you depute some constitutional experts to Nepal to help with our drafting? I said, look, unfortunately or fortunately, we have had one constitution since 1950, and we have continued with it. You people have 6 times as much experience since the same 70 years. So I think you're far more experienced than any Indian will be in how to draft your constitution. So you go ahead and draft it. Now, of course, the Europeans were there and so on and so on. So, you know, all of that. So for me, it was a non-starter. I don't, this notion of micromanaging, frankly, is something which is, again, a kind of, you know, again, it is a question of how unstable Nepal's domestic politics has been. So I think that the greater stability there is in Nepal's domestic politics, the less will be this apprehension about micromanaging. Last I saw was that last year there were all these wonderful reports and pictures of this, I don't know if this lady is still there, the Chinese ambassador who was, and each of her moves was being widely reported that at this time she goes and meets one political leader, at this time she goes and meets the president, at this time she goes and meets the prime minister, and so on. So there were all of these things. And I frankly don't know whether she is still there and how active she is. But so someone or the other always seems to be micromanaging. I mean, perhaps if there was a perception that India was doing it earlier, perhaps today maybe there is a perception that China is doing it. So maybe the reasons lie elsewhere. I think there was one question about the EPG report. Now, I have had this kind of question, and I was quite astonished on more than one occasion. I mean, when I was in the ministry, these EPGs became very popular about around after 2000 particularly. I think we must have set up at least 2 dozen EPG groups with different countries, with neighboring countries, with US. Sometimes they were called eminent persons, sometimes they were called round table, sometimes they were given some other name. Essentially, we had them with Sri Lanka, we had them with Bangladesh, we've had it with Singapore, we've had it with UK. I think it is called round table. We have had we've had it with France, where also I was posted, and therefore I have first-hand knowledge of it. We've had it with Germany, we've had it with EU, and things like that. They produce a report, they hand it over to the governments, and it is up to the governments to decide what to do with it. The members of the EPG are there in their personal capacities. They are all non-government people. The governments are not bound to accept or do anything with that report. I don't know why there is this strange kind of a notion in Nepal that the EPG's report is some huge document which is binding on governments. Of course not. Where do you think the EPG report is? It's probably lying in one drawer in the Nepal Foreign Ministry and another drawer in the Indian Foreign Ministry. If they want to use part of it, they will use it. If they don't want to use it, so be it. I mean, you know, we must have, as I said, with more than 24 of these EPGs, there must be at least over the last 20 years, there must be at least 100 such reports lying around in different divisions of the foreign ministry. Some of those recommendations may have been accepted and put into practice, but that is about it. If the EPG has completed its work, produced its report, and handed it over, then that is about it. Yes, there was perhaps an impression that the report had to be handed over. And I think to that extent, if somebody is interested, I think there is no harm. They can go and call on the foreign minister or on the foreign secretary or whoever it is and hand over the report. Maybe now that to and fro travel is going to be possible once the COVID business is under control, perhaps something like that can happen. You know, at a time when there is a next visit or a face-to-face meeting, they will hand over the report. So even if they hand over the report, that still doesn't make the report is not going to become public. None of these reports have become public. So this strange kind of this again is an example, a perfect example of miscommunication, misperception leading to an unnecessary myth getting created around the EPG. We talked of, I think there was another question about territory and, you know, which is also linked to the border and things like that. And here I did refer to it in a sense about when I said that Kalapani, we allowed it to pend. I mean, you know, we have had an open border, so people didn't really bother too much about it. And anyway, but it is always good to have a delineation of the border. And so to that extent, when the boundary group was set up and they completed their discussions and established the boundary pillars along 98% of the border, there were two areas that were left behind. One is Susta and one is Kalapani. I mean, Susta was because you've got rivers that, rivulets. These are not even rivers, they're small streams that keep changing their course. So, you know, so there was a bit of a discussion, nothing that can't be resolved. And similarly, you had this thing in Kalapani, and because the boundary goes back to the British days, which says the River Kali. Now, River Kali, as we call it, or as Nepal calls it, goes up to a point, and north of that, there are different tributaries. One goes slightly more to the east, one goes slightly more to the west. And again, it is something that should have been talked about, according to me, and that should have been sorted out. Unfortunately, it was not. But now you have a situation where last year, again, probably because of developments in domestic politics, Nepal decided to unilaterally adopt a constitutional amendment and draw a new boundary and establish a new boundary and ratify it by undertaking a constitutional amendment. It is now done. It is now part of their flag. It is now part of their constitution. So please tell me which foreign secretary of Nepal is prepared to discuss how this boundary is going to be, how this boundary issue is going to be taken up for negotiation. No official has the capacity unless there is another constitutional amendment in Nepal which authorizes the government of Nepal to open negotiations on a territorial question, I think any communication or any discussion on this is pointless. So we have now, unfortunately, pushed ourselves into a corner where we have created a territorial something that was a difference in terms of boundaries has now become a concrete problem. And which is why, and I think that the Nepalese side, the Nepalese government fully understands it, which is why nothing has happened on it. Because things have gone beyond a stage where officials can sit down and now discuss it. I mean, the officials, see, any official, we live in open societies. And therefore, if there is a discussion on the boundary issue, media will want to know, what have you discussed? Have the India, I mean, if the Nepalese foreign secretary or the Nepalese, whoever is the official home secretary or whoever it is who's discussing it, it says, well, we presented our map and the Indians have rejected it. I mean, it doesn't take you very far. And if they say, yes, we are discussing it, and then they'll say, well, what do the Indians want? And if they say, well, Indians want this particular alignment, then, you know, again, you get into a difficulty. So you have basically, by taking it and making it part of the constitution, the matter has been taken away from official level talks. It is no longer feasible. After all, when you decide to have negotiations with another country, today, let us say if we decide to review the Peace and Friendship Treaty, okay? Different prime ministers have already agreed at a prime ministerial level to do that. That is a matter of public record, right? So therefore, you can exchange, you will have meetings on this. If you want to review an existing treaty, like the Trade and Transit Treaty, there will be, that has a mechanism for review. Even the 1950 treaty, there is an existing treaty, and the last article of that provides for a review or for either country to withdraw after giving notice, which is fine. That is in the nature of the treaty. But I have not heard of countries negotiating on their respective constitutions. And the new boundary is ratified by Nepal's constitution.
Mr. Sood, there was a question for Constantino, and I think you can also respond to it because you have written an article long time back in Hindu, I think. The questioner asked that, is a special relationship between India and Nepal myth or reality? This was a question for Constantino. I think you can also respond as you have written on this. But please be brief, sir. We are running out, otherwise we'll run out of time.
Amit, I think you want Ambassador Sood to come.
Hello,
right?
Ambassador Sood.
Sorry, no, go ahead, Constantino. I mean,
Though there's a question for Constantino, which I think you can respond as you have written on this issue, and after that, Constantino can respond.
No, let Constantino respond to it
so
first. I mean, since,
Constantino, you have.
Yeah, it is addressed to him. I will come after him.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll have. I'm sure Ambassador Sood will have a better answer than mine. That I can guarantee you.
No,
and I think
Ambassador has already spoken.
No, but I think that's absolutely right. I think we.
One more question. There's one more question for you, Constantino. First is a special relationship. Then second is on how India and Nepal erase hindrances and extend friendly relations. This is a very common general question somebody has asked. How India and Nepal can extend friendly relations.
Got it. That's a very simple, easy question.
Yeah, normal.
So, I mean, I think I really enjoyed what Ambassador Sood just said. Again, the myths, the cliches. I think Avinash brought in a wonderful perspective also from the geostrategic north angle, right? He's really looking at this from a different angle of how China is looking at this. And I think what Avinash also cautions us to do is not to overrate the China um, capacity, influence, presence these days, right? And I think that goes to people in India, but I'd say that that takeaway from Avinash is particularly important for Nepal, where I think people often, naturally, after decades of particular dependence on India on many issues, economics, politics, diplomacy, now sees, this wonderful opportunity arising and is, of course, very focused on making the best out of that relationship with China. But sometimes when you wish for things very hard, it doesn't mean that they turn true, right? And you will sometimes maybe misdiagnose or let's say overrate certain things just because you're hopeful or wishful or you want them to come true. And I think that is a natural, I think time will take care of that, right? That there will be a natural adjustment towards what China can do and cannot do and will not do also, what it can and will not do for Nepal. I think that's what I often like to caution my Nepali friends, is that China sometimes has a lot of capacities, capabilities, and possibilities, but it chooses not to use them to support Nepal. That should not also be forgotten. I can think at least of a few examples where China actively chose not to come to support Nepal, including on issues of dispute with India. On the question by Dr. Surendra Rawat, I think, is a special relation a myth or reality? I'd say it's more of a myth than a reality today. I think there's no such thing as a special relationship in the actual sense. I mean, Portugal and the United Kingdom have a treaty-based relation since the 1300s, so almost 700 years. It's often called the oldest alliance in modern history. I mean, are UK-Portugal relationships special? Yes, they are. But does the UK come to support Portugal on many issues? No, it doesn't, right? There's a lot of divergence and problems. Is the Canada-US relationship special? Yes and no. I think all relationships are special in some way or the others. I think we all like to call things special when we want to make others feel good. Technically, yes, in terms of the Westphalian system, you could say the 1950 treaty has some exceptional circumstances and clauses there that make the relationship a bit more different than a typical modern state-to-state relationship. But my point is that as a realist, at least, I look at the actual concrete indicators of how relationships pan out, right? The actual transactional business between two different states. And there, I think there's nothing very special about India-Nepal relationship. And I would say even another myth, the open border. It puzzles me that people keep speaking about the open border as something very special or unique. What is the use of a piece of paper telling you that that border is open? And of some, I'm not wishing it completely away. It is an open border in the sense people can cross it. We don't even know how many Nepalis live in India, right? Because it's a complete sort of open circulation between both states, free movement. But what is that use of if it's very difficult to actually cross that border physically, right? And that's why I mentioned the hard indicators. Is the border really open in the modern, interdependent, technological sense of flows in the digital age of the current world economy? No, that border is more closed than technically closed borders that are easier to cross. I mean, go to Mexico and the US, where you have United States presidents being elected on manifestos of building walls and regulating and keeping the Mexicans out. And look at the largest border crossing points in today's world. Every day, day by day, there are dozens of thousands of Mexicans that go spend their day working in San Diego, for example, and come back in the evening to work in Mexico. That is an open border, but is it closed or not? For me, it's an open border. It's easy. You have a digital pass, you take your bus and you go in. There's no checking, there's nothing. You vet it, the systems work. Technically, what do we call this? An open or a closed border? But now try to take a bus from Kathmandu to Patna. Try to truck a piece of cloth or try to export textiles from Patna to Kathmandu on a truck. And look at the permits you have to pass. Look at the controls. Look at the hours you spend on the border. Look at the infrastructure of the controls, right? That's not an open border to me. And I'm being technical about this, but in the end, that is what matters. So it's beautiful to sit in Delhi and Kathmandu and say, we have a wonderful open border. And let's not fence it, or let's fence it, right? People keep asking me on both sides, like, what should we do about it? And there's a big discussion on fencing, not fencing. You can fence the whole border and it can still be more open than today. That is my point, right? In this current age, the border, the open border in that sense doesn't help us to see what's happening there. The question on making the relationship better, I don't have an answer for that. I think we've been all discussing it now, but I think Mr. Thapa and GP Acharya had two questions about how to improve it. I think Mr. Thapa's point was about soft and hard dimensions being simultaneous. I agree. You cannot do one without the other. My point is only that precedence must be given to the hard connectivity, right? If you don't have that hard connectivity between both countries, the basic infrastructural integration of those borderlands in both economies, digitally, in transportation-wise, you will not have the softer connectivity. Of course, you have to do cultural exchanges, people to people, but you can, ask students to come and study in North Bihar hospitals from Nepal, which they used to actually, right? If you look at Darbhanga even hospital, there were many Nepalis. There's still many, but lesser today. And why? Because it's just more difficult to, take transportation, come and go every day. And it's just easier maybe to go to another economy, into another hospital college, medical college, where you get better conditions, maybe 2 hours flight away from, 3 hours flight away from Kathmandu. And that's what you will see, by the way, in southern China emerging too. In fact, Amish Mumi's book, Avinash, that you mentioned, has a wonderful chapter where things are just happening on the ground, right? In certain little provinces in the north of Nepal, people are going to work now in the booming cities, small cities on the border regions of Tibet. They're marrying there, right? And these are not old relations they had. Of course, the Buddhist links, the cultural links. It's just because the economy is booming on the other side. So today, your incentives, if you're in the border areas of Nepal in the north, is to get your job on that side. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. Therefore, that infrastructural condition is a precondition. And the question about, I think, Raghu Bishta, about does Nepal have a sovereign foreign policy? I find sovereign foreign policy a contradiction in terms. No country has a sovereign foreign policy, an independent, another term I think I find contradictory foreign policy. Technically, yes, you decide what you think is best for your country, but do you think India has an independent foreign policy? No, it doesn't. India has an autonomous foreign policy where it tries to navigate different pressures and demands that is also exposed to. The Chinese expect things from India, the US expects things from India, the Japan has expectations from India. So, and you have trade relationships you have to preserve, you have images, views, etc. So no country has a blissfully independent foreign policy it can imagine and set in stone and go with it. And so does Nepal. I think it's important to recognize this myth that Nepal has to be, completely independent and free in making its foreign policy. That's an imagination. In practice, any Nepali diplomat can tell you that there are constant constraints, and the diplomacy is actually an art of the possible rather than, I think, the certainty of some theory and clear guidelines that you can follow systematically, unwaveringly in your relations with other countries.
And Mr. Sood?
Well, I mean, which one was the question? I'm sorry.
Oh,
I was listening very carefully to what Constantino was saying. So So which was the one that you wanted me to address?
It's on a special relationship.
Between special relationship. I think that has already been addressed in a sense by Constantino. I mean, the special relationship exists because of certain shared histories, free movement of people, and all the rest of it. You know, and after all, if I look at it, the Prime Minister is Khadga Prasad Sharma Oli. I mean, before him, you have had Madhav Nepal, you have had Pushpa Kamal, you have had Jhala Nath, you had Girija Prasad, you had Sher Bahadur. I mean, these names could be easily names which we are all familiar with, in a sense that, you know, and this perhaps is the unusual part in, you know, I cannot think of a Nepalese prime minister who is called she whatever or Lee whatever or things like that. And I think this tells its own story. So the fact that you celebrate Diwali and you celebrate Dashera and you have Ika and Bhai Dooj and, you know, all of that, but that is what leads to the special relationship. And but the special relationship needs to be nurtured, as I think Constantino has very eloquently described. It needs to be nurtured, because you can't just have a special relationship. And incidentally, this again is a big myth, that, you know, the special relationship, I noticed from some of the questions that, you know, it pertains only with the Madhesis, and the Madhesis, they come and marry on this side and we marry on that side, or whatever it is. And there was something about citizenship. The special relationship exists with the Ranas. I know n number of Rana families and Shah families where there have been cross-border marriages. Even today, it continues. So I don't think that this is something that is exclusively restricted to the Madhesis in the Tarai areas. I think this has been existing across societies. There have been a lot of instances of cross-border marriages going back hundreds of years, from Rana kings and from the Rana rulers and the Shah, the monarchy family, the Shahs and so on, with people in Himachal, in Uttarakhand, in you know, princely families there, in Rajasthan, in even as far as Orissa. So again, I think it is these kind of ties which contribute to a special relationship, because that is there. But as I said, and as Constantino said, as I mentioned earlier, that if we want to use this special relationship, then we need to do some hard work in terms of building the hard connectivity. Because I think I was very, I think it's absolutely accurate that you can have a fence and you can have a more open border than notionally an open border where, it takes you so much time to get a consignment of goods across, because you don't have banking facilities, or you don't have proper customs facilities, or you don't have proper road infrastructure, etc., etc. So you need to develop that in order to actually capitalize, rather than have this mental myth, this fond notion of an open border.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. Dr. Avinash, do you have any final remarks on this? Any question you can respond to?
Yeah, a couple of points, so that sovereignty and foreign policy.
Please be brief, because we are already running out of time.
Yeah, 90 seconds. So to add to 2 points that Tino made. So foreign policy as a process rather than as an event. When you look at it as a process, you'll understand the issue of sovereignty differently. That's my one short point. The second is, also mentioned the Darbhanga Medical College, and we saw its status in the present COVID scenario. And that's not an isolated case. A lot of India's neighborhood policy is an internal problem, actually. The capacity building that we dream of creating for our neighbors is not there in our borderlands and in our poorest of the districts. So this is our internal problem, and that is something lagging for a long time. And again, that's something that cannot be wished away in a quick time. The one point I missed is there's a new round of US-China strategic competition in Nepal, and I think there's a greater need to focus on that to see what direction it takes in the years to come, and I think that will be interesting to watch as well. One last point I wanted to mention on the opening up of the India-Nepal flights. Can it be the first case of vaccine passport being worked out for reopening of the bilateral air relations? Right now it's very limited, but more can be done on the basis of that, and we can also experiment on the vaccine passport basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Avinash sir. Finally, I would like to say we had a very fruitful conversation, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed it. And I would like to thank Nice and my colleague Vinny for all help. So, and we would love to hear you on other occasion on the same theme or any other thing. Thanks all.
Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express our sincere gratitude and thanks to the chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention, and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.